Hello YouTube. Both rats and mice are intelligent and highly resourceful. Their natural cunning has allowed them to adapt to just about every environment on Earth. Here's an example from the 1950s. After the test of the British hydrogen bomb on Bikini Atoll in the Pacific, it was some years before the island was declared safe enough for scientists to visit. When they did, they found out the island was overrun by rats. The rats had not only survived the nuclear blast, but the high levels of radiation as well. The ability to live and thrive in extreme environments explains the remarkable success of these rodents. It is not clear what species will be victorious in the deadly conflict with mankind over our planet. It would be reasonable for humanity not to enhance the rodents, but the mankind is not the brightest of the species on this planet, and we often do things that are detrimental to our own future. In 2004, a sensational news story spread around the world. The Anglo-American team of geneticists was able to completely decipher the genome of rats. That is, to find out which of the 25,000 genes of these animals is responsible for a particular function. Incredibly, at the genetic level, these rodents turned out to be very similar to humans, whose genome was decoded a little earlier. A human is not much different from a mouse from the point of view of geneticists. A team of researchers from the United States and the United Kingdom determined that the length of the mouse genetic code, 2.5 billion pairs of nucleotides, is only slightly behind the human one, which has 2.9 billion pairs. We have about 30,000 genes, and with mice, 80% are genetically the same, and 99% are very similar. Apes, even the most humanoid ones, do not reach such a similarity. At the time, scientists at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Israel, led by Professor Itai Bob, released the microtomographic atlas of the mouse skeleton, and for the first time looking at mice in great detail, down to the smallest bones in the size of a fraction of a millimeter, and found out the mice, have skeletons that are almost human-like. Okay? There is a great deal of fundamental similarity according to Itai Bob, unless, of course, you take into the account the features of the bones of the face, the feet, and the scale, and the tail. According to the scientists, humans have common bone tissue pathologies with mice. Both species get sick in the same way. And here is something from Germany. European mice are smarter than Russian mice, according to the results obtained by German researchers from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Biology. It was the research group Behavioral Ecology of Individual Differences, Department for Evolutionary Genetics of the Max Planck Institute. Of the three species that participated in experiments, a kind of competition for intelligence took place, and the Europeans showed the best results. Scientists tested the hypothesis that house mice, synanthropic in scientific terms, or more simply living near people, fall under their people influence. Borrowing food from their older brothers, so to say, the animals are forced to exercise caution and prudence. They hide, they find ways to quickly move around the house and come up with ways to avoid falling into traps. And that just infuriates the humans. After all, the goals of people are exactly the opposite: to get rid of mice. If the hypothesis is correct, then the mice whose synanthropization began earlier should be smarter than their colleagues who settle in the houses later. Well, it is known that mice were attracted to people in the Middle East about 14,000 years ago. From there, on ships carrying grain and other goods, they reached Europe, forming as a result three populations. Western house mice, Eastern house mice, which became closer to the population of the Balkans, and East Asian house mice. Synanthropization of the first began just the same 14,000 years ago, the second about 8,000 years ago, and the third even later, about 4,000 years. Well, a German scientist, Anja Gunther, and her colleagues captured domestic mice from all three populations, 148 of them, adult males and females. They were put in cages and forced to solve various logical problems. Having decided correctly, like opening something, moving it, pulling it up, the animals got to the food. The Western house mice were fastest at their tasks. They were successful 80% of the time. The Eastern mice barely completed half of the tasks. The East Asian mice even less, and even slower. The obvious conclusion, the hypothesis is correct. The proximity of people contributes to a very rapid development of cognitive abilities, at least in mice. And I say humbug. I cannot accept the statement that Russian or, let's say, Soviet mice and rats were less intelligent than European. And I'll give you a few examples. During the World War II, survivors of the Leningrad blockade say that together with Nazis who surrounded the city, a rat force attacked the residents from the city basements. According to eyewitnesses, the rats were simply gigantic in size. It was useless to fight them, as they were very intelligent. In the winter of 1943, detailed pillagers openly attacked people. They raided warehouses at night. Witnesses claimed that the attack on the warehouses was so well organized that the armed men were powerless against the rats. And they went to drink, for example, in a herd, blocking the streets. The experience of Peter the Great, our emperor, helped to save the situation. The townspeople remember the stories of their grandfathers and grandmothers about how in the Peter's times the rats seized the Kronstadt warehouses. Then cats were caught all over Russia and brought to Kronstadt. So, when the road of life was paved along Ladoga to help broach the blockade, one of the first cargo was biological weapons against rats, so-called smoky cats and cats from the Yaroslav region. And a month later, the meowing troops or cats repelled the invasion of rats. Also, during the World War II, unwilling to recognize the superiority of the Red Army, German propaganda blamed the Wehrmacht, their army's defeats at Moscow, at Stalingrad on the weather and various force majeure. Among the creators of Soviet military victories, the Germans named three generals: General Frost, General Mud, and General Mouse. Well, if everything is relatively clear with the first two, then there are questions about the mouse. When and how did the rodents help the Red Army? Well, throughout the night and morning on November 19, 1942, German and Romanian positions north of Stalingrad were subjected to heavy artillery fire with howitzers and Katyusha rockets. After the artillery preparation, the troops of the southwestern and Don fronts went on the offensive, breaking through the defenses and overturning the 3rd Romanian Army. German troops rushed to their aid. It was planned to stop the Soviet offensive with a powerful counterattack of the 22nd Panzer Division. But this is where the problem came in, that the Germans realized. Many Nazi tanks, which had been in reserve for several days in the Don steppes, simply did not start up. The ignition did not work. It turned out that numerous tanks had in them damaged electrical wiring. It was possible, quite possible, to fix the malfunction in the field, but it took precious time, which prevented the Wehrmacht tank troops from conducting an emergency deployment, and the direction was lost. Later, when the search for saboteurs was taken by the Nazi German command, it was found out that the fault was with the usual field mice. In search of a warm shelter, they climbed into the tanks, which the Germans kept constantly warmed up in the cold weather. Well, in search of food, small pests gnawed or ate everything they could get to. The most delicious they found the insulation of electrical wires. As a result, the electrical wires suffered. This is how the Soviet historian Boris Fedorov described it. But the most interesting thing is that such participation of mice in the offensive operation of the Red Army was not accidental. It was planned and implemented by a teacher from the Smolensk University, Doctor of Biological Sciences, Igor Valenko. During the war, he worked in a special training center for demolition dogs. But the training took a long time and the dogs themselves perished, which significantly reduced the effectiveness of this method of fighting tanks. Being a religious believer, which was not safe in the USSR, Valenko knew the Bible well. Remembering the Egyptian plagues, he thought that the mice could be a new, inexpensive way to deal with enemy manpower and equipment. The first test was conducted in April of 1942. The field mice were dropped from the plane in crates near German tank troops, and they disabled a number of vehicles, damaging their electrical wiring. A larger operation was planned for the fall of the same year. The fact is that field mice are carriers of tularemia, an unpleasant infectious disease characterized by fever, skin rashes, and inflammation of the lymph nodes. It was this disease that was planned to infect the German soldiers. To do this, the mice were previously, so to say, landed in the area of the deployment of the Wehrmacht Panzer Division. The Germans then managed to avoid the epidemic due to the slow development of the disease, but the tanks were still put out of action. But actually, something more interesting and suspenseful took place 13 years earlier. Few details are available today, but here's what we know. In 1929, in the Soviet city of Saratov, in an atmosphere of the strictest secrecy, a biological laboratory began its activity, in which the military and scientists jointly tried to grow super beings who could follow orders, physically be very hardy, survive in any conditions, and not cause suspicion in the enemy. The starting material for the experiments were rats, with a unique sense of smell and fantastic survivability. Their jaws gnaw at metal, and the skeleton is similar to the human one. It was assumed that after artificial evolution, their front paws would be as close as possible to the structure of the hands. And most importantly, scientists were sure that in the conditions created for them, the rats would advance much more in their development than humanity would in a century. Almost 5 decades later, in 1989, the lab rats were released. It is quite likely that this was a common coincidence, but in the same 1989, immediately after the closure of the Saratov secret biological laboratory, newspapers began to write, vying with each other, about appearance of strange super beings in the Moscow metro or subway. They were encountered in the tunnels by truck inspectors, trains were impeded, and their traces were found at stations. Few people know that the subway system is not only stations, trains, and rails. It is also a complex drainage system containing a huge number of collectors and risers connected to the city's sewer system and underground rivers. But officially, the management of the Moscow metro subway by any means disavowed the idea of the existence of mutant rats. But rumors persistently circulated around the city that the capital is fighting with underground rodents. Allegedly, paratroopers with flamethrowers and machine guns descended on the tracks at night. Many Moscow diggeri, and you should look up my video about these people, they also met rats of incredible size. According to them, these creatures are still concentrated in the cattle tunnels under the capital's meat processing plants. The life of rats in such places, due to the abundance of blood and offal, simply turned into paradise. The results of water samples in Moscow underground sewers led experts to horror. The content of nitrogen and heavy metals exceeded the permissible norm 20 times. In much difficult conditions, some organisms die out, and some quietly exist, including mutant rats that can adapt to any conditions. Are they really the result of the eco-disaster that has already occurred on the underground floor of the Russian capital? Although some researchers say that another version or hypothesis is more plausible, these giant individuals, so to say, demonstrate a failure in the work of a secret laboratory, in which for decades peaceful rodents were turned into saboteurs and spies. Few of those who worked in the Saratov laboratory are still alive today, and if they are, they're not so willing to talk about this period of their lives. But the most talkative ones remembered, and that was simply amazing what they remember. There were only 3 enclosures in the laboratory. Once every 2 weeks, one of them simulated a change in the season so that the rats evolved faster. In the second one, a certain level of radiation was constantly maintained, and in the third enclosure, a control group of rodents was simply placed. During the day, junior lab staff fed them, cleaned their cages, and monitored their conditions. At this time of the day, the subjects usually slept, but their night schedule was scheduled by the minute. Psychologists, geneticists, and doctors worked with the rats. Junior employees were not allowed to enter the laboratory at that time. Even in appearance, the military rodents were different from ordinary rats. They had large heads, and their forelegs were very much like hands, human hands. Such night training continued until June 1989, and when the decision came to eliminate the biological laboratory, all the documentation and animals had to be destroyed in stages. But it was not possible to do so because all the laboratory super rats chewed through a thick concrete wall into a tunnel that runs under all 3 enclosures and is connected to the ventilation system, and they escaped. Many laboratory workers still believe that the rats knew in advance that they would be killed and therefore arranged an escape. Today, there are only dilapidated buildings on the site of the laboratory. Not a single document has been preserved. There is no information about the further fate of the last 189th generation of the inhabitants of the aviaries, as it's called. Only one thing is known. Among the rats caught in the wild, there were both males and females, which means that somewhere there is already 190 and even a 200th generation of rodents, and even more so considering the time this information came out. And the offsprings of the old-timers of the secret laboratory are functioning in Russia. According to biologists, these mutant rats do not pose a great danger to humans. In terms of their survivability, they are somewhat behind the usual gray inhabitants of the dungeon, meaning common rats. They're among the communication and tunnels. They created their own civilization, these mutant rats, a highly organized society with its own orders, laws, and hierarchy, where there is no place for outsiders. The struggle for survival forces these animals to improve all the time. Russian dungeon explorers or diggeri talk about the unique features of the rat community. in an incomprehensible way, news about the dangerous zones, rat poisons, and traps become known to all of the four-legged inhabitants of the underground city. Sometimes such news cause entire rat cities to migrate. Now, I am sure there have been experiments, and recently too, in a number of countries, seeking creation of more enhanced rodents, rats. I've read such news items not that long ago. Well, the problem is sometimes such super species escape, and we do not know what the consequences can be. And I am not sure if anybody controls this. So I wanted to bring you this interesting episode from the Soviet and Russian history. As I'll bring you more, I thank you for your attention. If you can help my research, you can find ways to do so by reading description to this video. And again, thank you for your attention. Please subscribe, please like, and please let others know about my channel. Thank you.